Thank you very much for inviting me to present at MPN Horizons as we go virtual. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Zack Pemberton Whiteley. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at Leukemia Care in the UK, as well as the Chair of the Acute Leukemia Advocates Network. I'm delighted to be here talking about one of my favourite topics, which is how you can use evidence for advocacy impact. So the first question really is, what is evidence and what's evidence-based advocacy? As always with advocacy, we're not looking at this just from an academic perspective. We're looking at this from the perspective of trying to achieve a patient advocacy objective. And that's where collecting good data comes together with advocacy work and really good advocacy work, and putting in a good communications package to be able to influence the audience that you have in mind. So the first question here is really, why would you use evidence? And a little bit of a joke here, but you use evidence because people will believe you. People are much more willing to see evidence as credible rather than individual opinions. And quite rightly, because it shows that you've put in the work, you understand the topic you're talking about, and that people should take you seriously. But the greater part of why we should be using evidence to influence all of our work as patient advocates is because of the understanding it creates. It's very easy as advocates for us to think that we know everything that the patient community is experiencing. And we do. We know what the common issues are that are happening amongst patients because we hear them every day on our helplines, in our support groups. But they may not be representative of the wider patient community. And this slide here on the left-hand side is a third party looking on at somebody, whether that third party is a clinician looking on as a patient or whether it's a patient organisation looking on. We see things from our own perspective, and from the image on the right is when you actually see it from the user's perspective or the patient. So we need to make sure that we're seeing things as patients see them. We're not seeing them skewed towards a particular group of patients who are more likely to contact us, or from our own personal experiences. We're the voice of patients as patient advocates, and we have to really make sure that we are speaking up for what actually matters to patients. And as part of that, I see a huge responsibility on the patient community to use evidence-based advocacy to drive change. If we want to be effective as organisations, it's gone beyond the point where we can expect to be listened to because we're bringing individual stories or individual perspectives. Of course, it's important we still have those. They're very emotive. They can help us drive change and be supportive and reflective of some of the evidence we're bringing. But on their own, they're not enough. I'll talk slightly more later on about a project that we ran in the UK called Living with Leukemia, where we mapped the experience of leukemia patients with different types and looked at what some of the issues were affecting their day-to-day lives. And we've used them in a number of areas to try and drive advocacy change going forward, but I'll come back to that later. So the first question you might be asking yourself is how to use evidence. And as I said, evidence is there to help with understanding. And that means we need to listen to the evidence, and we then need to act on what the evidence is telling us. We do not use the evidence just to prove or demonstrate an existing point of view we already have. Now, of course, it's quite natural to do that because you run a project, you run a survey, for example, about a topic you already think is an issue. But you need to really listen to what the evidence is telling you and not just selectively pick the bits that back up your existing arguments. And as patient organisations, methodology is key. We're not academics. We're not here to publish papers. That's not why we're doing it. We're doing it to enable us to drive advocacy change. But if we don't get the methodology right, it's very easy for your quite genuine findings to be torn apart on the basis that the methodology doesn't make sense, so we can't rely on them. And that means that when you're working out how to run your project, you need to make sure it's being done validly, and you need to make sure that you can't just negate some of the findings about what's important to patients because the survey wasn't run in a way that's methodologically sound. And when you're looking at projects, and I'd like to do this before we run a project, but it's also important to do it at the end when you're considering the results. And you need to actually stop and say, are the metrics you're using the right ones? Does the evidence actually show what you think it does? Did you ask the right question to answer the point you want to demonstrate? Did you ask the right people? Did you ask all patients, or did you just ask a subset? Did you ask enough people? If you run a project, a survey, or a focus group where you only have 10 people, is that sufficient for you to talk about the group you're talking about? Now, for a very rare particular issue, it may well be. For an issue that affects the whole MPN patient community, asking 10 individuals is probably not enough. So it all depends on the context. And then we need to be careful about what conclusions we can draw from the data. If you look, for example, at the issue of emotional health or anxiety and depression, they're very different things. And you need to be very careful that the question you asked is what you're actually saying in your conclusion. You're not miscommunicating terms. You're not saying, oh, well, they said this, so we can sort of say they said this. It's not the same thing. The question that you asked, all you can say from the survey is what the question was. And then one of the things that patient advocacy groups quite often get asked about in their surveys is whether, again, coming back to methodology, but were the findings statistically valid? And I'm not just here talking about statistical significance at the P is 0.05 level, where if you ask 20 questions, at least one of them has to be statistically significant. That's what it means. But you have to really understand are the minor changes you're seeing in some areas, do they mean something? Are they actually impactful, or are they just slight differences based on who happened to fill in the survey? So if we're talking about how to do some of this in practice, this is a slide from the work group of European Cancer Advocacy Networks Academy and training specifically on how to do evidence-based advocacy. And this sets out the broad process for how you may want to run any project where you're looking to generate evidence on an advocacy objectives. Now, depending on the type of project, of course, you would put more resources and time into some parts of this. It's possible to do very, very quick surveys on, say, SurveyMonkey, where you can get them out in a few days and run them and have them open for a couple of weeks and the whole project be done in a month. And clearly the kind of work that goes into the background of that kind of project would be very different from a project where you were planning to influence the scientific community and you wanted to publish your findings. In that case, you'd need to put a lot more work into the early stages of a project to make sure you've got it correct. But generally, if I was allocating timings to this, I would suggest that organisations spent roughly a third of the project, and I'm talking here perhaps 6 months, possibly more, on setting the strategy, setting the question that you want to run evidence generation about, and designing your survey to make sure that the questions really cover the topics that you want to cover. The second of the 3 phases, which is implementation and actually running the survey, again, should take about a third of your time, somewhere between 6 months. Is actually usually the shortest part of your project, running the survey, because you don't need field work can last up to 3 months. Beyond that point, I don't find any particular benefit in having a survey open for much longer than that, particularly at the moment with how rapidly things change. And then the third part, which is the data analysis, the publications, the reporting, the bit where you communicate the findings of your results. People often don't put enough work in at the beginning to think of the project, thinking about the analysis, because at the end of the day, you need to be able to, as I said, show that your findings were methodologically sound and make sure you have all of the things you want to say in your analysis. You need to ask the questions at the beginning to be able to do that. So that's why I say link very much to what is the question you're asking about, your strategy or research question. Come back to that throughout, and then think about that at the end, so that you really are reporting based on what it was that you wanted to say. So really sums it up here. Be clear from the start how you want to use the data, and come back to it at every stage of the project. So setting your strategy and research question, how do you do that? At the outset of the project, think about what are you trying to achieve? So some questions here to help flag this up. What are you trying to show? Who are you trying to show it to? What is it you actually want to do? What evidence do you already have? And only then collect evidence on the things you don't already know. Everything comes back to this question, and that drives the type of project that you should be doing. So what is already known, and then what kind of evidence project you need to do? This is just a rule of thumb that's right most of the time. If it's already known to you and it's already known to others, use the existing evidence. You don't need to run another project. If it's known to you but not known to others, then you probably need to have quantitative evidence such as surveys to demonstrate a point you already know to be true, but to quantify it and prove it to others. If others know about it and you don't, then it's usually picked up by some basic desk research, finding out what evidence already exists, quantifying that and bringing it together. You don't tend to need to run your own evidence project. And then the most difficult and often quite interesting is things that you don't know about and others don't know about. And these tend to come up through qualitative research projects, things like focus groups, things like individual patient interviews. People bring up issues you haven't thought about. You can't pick those up through surveys because you wouldn't know to ask the question in the first place. And the particular thing that's interesting from an advocacy perspective here is sometimes what's known to you as an organisation may not be known to other stakeholders. Patients have a very different perspective on certain topics, and quite often the evidence that is generated won't agree with what you're hearing from the patient community. So you may want to run an evidence project to find out whether what you're hearing is correct. So if you are going to then go on and run an evidence generation project, there's different approaches that you can potentially take, and this may vary based on which type of project you're running. For quantitative projects, usually a questionnaire with tick box questions, multiple choice, is usually the most appropriate. I would try and restrict the number of written or oral questions in this kind of format because it's a lot of work to analyse, although it does sometimes bring some good quotes. So a mixture of the two of them can be useful. Clearly, if you're looking for qualitative information, an interview with written open questions is going to be the best type of approach. But as I say, usually I try and stick to a mixture of them. In terms of designing the questions, sometimes you will have to design your own because nobody will have run a survey in this area before, and that's quite common for a patient survey. But normally there's a lot of existing questions out in the public domain that you can look, you can replicate, you can build on. In particular, EORTC has an item library where you can look up questionnaires that have already been designed, and you can use entire tools as part of that, as part of your questionnaire, or you can pick individual questions and build them in alongside the new questions you've created. And just to really emphasize the point, don't run an evidence project just for the sake of it and because it's in trend at the moment. Run it because you have a particular advocacy change that you want to achieve, and focus all of your evidence generation on those questions. Don't ask wide-ranging questions, ask the questions about the thing you actually want to know about and change. And just another slide here to show that this isn't all about what we're doing as patient advocacy organisations. There's a lot of stages at which we can use evidence that we've already generated, or we can be involved in wider evidence generation, such as being involved in clinical trial, protocol design, etc., to make sure that the patient voice is helping generate the evidence that matters to patients in other settings. This doesn't always have to be generated by the patient community. So a short case study here of what we did in the UK as Leukemia Care. So the aim of our project was to understand patient experience in the UK and look particularly how this varied for different leukemia types. And we asked patients a series of questions from the point of diagnosis onwards to see how they had been impacted on their daily lives. We tested it with a series of individual patients of different leukemia types in the UK to make sure the content was correct and was asking the questions that we wanted to ask. And we've run this a number of times, and we've looked to compare the results between the different annual versions. Now, this was set up in a particularly interesting way in that we had multiple groups we were asking questions to. And this was partly to try and answer one of the questions you frequently get asked as patient groups as to, if you recruit purely through patient organisations, do the respondents reply differently, i.e. are the patients representative? Is it a skewed sample? And there are a number of differences we noted as part of it. I'm not going to go into them now, but if you're interested, the whole report's available on our website. But the thing I would draw here is, depending on what you want to do with the evidence, consider what your different output types are. And I'll talk in a minute about how you can use the evidence from a project like this. But there are lots of different ways you can present the data. There's lots of different ways it can come out. So that may be the full report, which, as I said, is on our website. It may be presentations at key events to your stakeholders or to people you're trying to influence, such as when we launched them in the Houses of Parliament in the UK at a time when that was a thing you were able to do and everything wasn't virtual. If you're interested in influencing the scientific community, you may want to do scientific publications, whether that's posters or journal articles. Really depends on how in-depth the project is. And also, one of the things I find from evidence generation projects is they create more questions than they answer. So they may actually be a starter as an idea of a particular follow-up project you need to do, or even further evidence that you need to generate. So some examples of how patient groups can use real-world evidence in their activities. I'm going to go very quickly through a number of these, but there's so many ways you can use evidence. The first one is simply defining the unmet needs. So the project I've already talked about, where we had a number of issues we already knew, and we wanted to understand how widespread they were. So this survey allowed us to quantify known issues and look at how those issues varied between different groups, whether that was demographically, whether that was different parts of a country, and identify potential solutions based on how widespread certain issues were. We've also then, as an organisation, used that to drive all of our strategic activities. So we create a strategy document that's about 100 or so pages that sets out what we're doing as an organisation and where we're going to work, where we're going to put resources, where we're going to put our time, in order to make sure we have the greatest impact on the lives of people affected by leukemia and other blood cancers. And what that means is you need to really understand and have quantified the patient experience. So you can say, should we be putting more resource behind an issue because it's more widespread than we thought it was? Should you be putting your resources in a different area? What's going to be most impactful for the lives of people affected? And this is another part. It's not that you don't just have to use the evidence you've already got. When you're doing this, you can measure further outcomes and impact as you go along to make sure that your evidence is keeping up to date and that actually you can see whether you're having a good job of impacting the areas you're trying to change. One other thing that may come out of this is you may identify an unmet need and you may say, well, actually, we need to develop a new service. And the evidence you've generated as part of your survey is really helpful for, say, funding applications to show this is an issue, this is what we'd like to do to solve this issue, and this is how we're going to measure whether or not we're successful. And if it's difficult to get the funding, in some countries it's more difficult than others, consider running a small pilot, if you can do so, to demonstrate it works, because that's even better evidence to support a funding application. One other type of activity you can do using evidence is campaigns. So in particular here, we run a campaign called Spot Leukemia, which is seeking to raise public awareness of the common symptoms of leukemia and encourage early diagnosis. So you really have to think here about what your audience is, who you're targeting, and what it is that you want to change. Because with campaigning, all of the messaging needs to focus about what they don't already know and what you want them to know. There's no point, for example, trying to tell patients about early diagnosis because it's too late. And they, in many cases, will already know all of the things you're trying to tell them. But they can be useful to communicate that information to a broader audience. And as I say here, not all of the evidence has to be generated by you. So although we relied quite heavily on the evidence that came out of our patient survey, we also looked at external sources of evidence, such as the proportion of patients being diagnosed via different routes in the UK through the official statistics. Now, if you want to campaign about a particular patient issue, in this case, we were campaigning about watch and wait and the impact it was having emotionally on patients, then surveys can be a great way to demonstrate the evidence of that alongside individual patient stories who can go a bit more deeply into the issue, and bringing the two of them together can be really, really powerful. So we use the evidence to drive where our campaign should be going, but then the evidence actually we produced a report about it, which we distributed for clinicians at the British Society of Haematology meeting. But the evidence took a back seat because the campaign mostly focused on how we could better support patients and being driven by patient stories, which was much more powerful. And one of the other ways you can use evidence is access decisions. So I could do an entire talk around patient involvement in HTA and where the role is of evidence. But if we want to drive change here, if we want to be listened to in the decisions about which drugs patients should have available to them, how important they are to their daily lives, we really need to up our game here, and we need to bring evidence, quantitative evidence of what matters to patients and the benefits that particular treatments can have on their daily lives. A lot of that evidence comes from clinical trials from pharmaceutical companies. But if we want to have a role on behalf of patients speaking up in the process, we need to go beyond individual stories, and we need to bring evidence, and that evidence needs to focus on the things that influence decision making, such as in the UK, cost effectiveness. It's not good enough to talk just about involvement. We need to focus on things that impact on the decision. So, final section, and I'll hand over to the next speaker. Thank you very much.